My parents hated Catholicism and I grew up Protestant, but I converted to Catholicism anyways, and here's the biggest reasons why. At the end, I'm gonna call my parents and see what they think about me being Catholic now. The first reason why I became Catholic was that I was confused. Growing up, I didn't even know what a Catholic was. But I remember when I was in high school, walking down the street past all these different churches. Anglican, Lutheran, Baptist, Orthodox, even a Mormon church. I was like, they all disagree on different things. They all look different. But there's got to be one that's more right than others. And so this led me to kind of start exploring different denominations. And that was the initial spark for me to consider the Catholic Church. But I also faced some opposition because when I first started saying that I'm interested in Catholicism, at first my parents were confused. Like, what are you missing at Calvary Chapel, the church I was going to at the time, which was a non-denominational church? And then some of my relatives were like, Catholics worship the devil, the Pope is the Antichrist, Catholics are crazy, Catholics are not Christian. I was like, whoa, guys, I'm just thinking about it. And so I didn't have an incentive to be Catholic. But despite this, I started investigating into the claims of the Catholic Church, especially it saying that it's the one true church, the church started by Jesus Christ. I also partly saw this as a solution to all the confusion I saw of these different denominations. Because I was like looking at all these churches, and I was like, if I'm gonna be in the church, I've gotta be in the church that follows Jesus Christ's teachings most closely. I would think stuff like, what did the early Christians do? What did the early Christians look like? What church were they in? What beliefs did they have? And I wanted to look most similar to them. But there was a stronger reason why I was converting, and it would tug at me for years. I think my first spark for conversion happened during the pandemic. COVID-19 happened when I was a freshman in high school. In late middle school and early high school, I was a lukewarm Christian. I was the kind of guy who was scared to say he was Christian, scared to say he was against abortion. I would hang out with friends that were anti-Christian. But I remember the pandemic happens, I'm sitting at home, and I'm like, you know what? I gotta start taking stuff seriously. This is also around the time where I got like on a self-improvement journey. I started working out, trying to do different online businesses. I started reading. I started reading books. But anyways, I also started to get stronger in my faith. And so this is when I started going back to Calvary Chapel regularly. I went every single Sunday. I went to the young adult groups. I was everywhere. There was an event, Evan was there. And I was really trying my best to dive headfirst in my faith. And I liked it. The people there were cool. The pastors were relatable. I liked the music. I still like non-denominational worship music. But I couldn't help but feel that there was something missing. And I couldn't put it into words at the time, but I now realize that it was shallow. I thought it was corny. I'm just being honest. I felt like when I left Calvary Chapel, I didn't feel spiritually refreshed. It almost felt like an obligation. And I saw this within my own family, with how they treated church. They would go to church because it's the right thing to do. They would earnestly try to listen at church and think about it, and they would go home, but there was nothing more than that. And so this was around the time, combined with the fact that I was confused with so many denominations, that I actually decided to go to a Catholic church for the first time. And I remember walking into a Catholic church for the first time, and I was like, this is weird. I was like, why is the pastor wearing weird clothes? Why are people speaking foreign languages? Why does it look like everyone wants to end themselves here? I was so confused. But I also thought it was weirdly beautiful. And so I kept on returning again and again and again. And gradually over time, my questions were answered. And that was the initial reason why I was pulled towards Catholicism. But also my parents were continuing to grow in their frustration with me, which makes it even crazier that I'm going to call them at the end of this video. I don't know what they're going to say, like truly. But this is where the third reason for why I became Catholic truly began to unfold, and it was its emphasis on authority and unity. I remember one of the last times I was at Calvary Chapel, they were going to allow females to become deacons. And I remember this being a crazy moment for the church because this had never happened in the 30 years it existed. You get the point. 30 years have gone by, everyone said this is not allowed, this is not biblical, and they did allow it. And it was almost begrudgingly. And sure, they were super conservative with other aspects. You know, female pastors, they would say that would never happen. Blessing same-sex marriages, never gonna happen. But I couldn't help but feel that this was an example of a lot of situations at Protestant churches where they keep on having moral drifts. As far as I could tell, Calvary Chapel didn't have a method to stop this. Because at the end of the day, it just depended on what the pastor thought. And I literally saw this firsthand. The pastor allowed female deacons, people left because of that. And they went to another church. And I was like, well, what about if they disagree with that church and this church? And they just keep on bouncing around from church to church to church. Where does it end? Because I was like, if Jesus Christ is going to establish a church, why would he allow moral decay to happen? I mean, obviously moral decay is inevitable to certain degrees, but he would have an authority and a system to stop this. And I saw this most clearly in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church teachings have remained strong. And while most Christian churches can agree that abortion and blessing same-sex marriages are wrong, there are other issues, like for example, like contraception or IVF, that are a bit more in the gray area, and these churches allow it. The Catholic Church does not allow it. And so this was one of those things where I was like, the Catholic Church has remained strong, and it will continue to remain strong for the decades, centuries, millenniums to come. Also, can you double check that you're subscribed? I want to hit 100K subscribers within 1 year to prove that the Catholic Church is not dead. It's not, but subscribe if you want to. And that's another thing that led me into reason 4 and why I became Catholic. The history. I remember growing up at Calvary Chapel, going like every single week, praying nightly, reading my Bible, having prayers at the dinner table. I didn't know any Christians before 100 years ago. C.S. Lewis was like the oldest Christian I knew. I never learned about the martyrs from the early church. I never learned about all these different councils and disagreements I now know about now. I never even knew what early Christians would have looked like. I basically had in my mind a version of history that was the Bible, early Christians recorded in Acts and the Paul letters, a large 2,000-year gap, and then the 1960s when Calvary Chapel came around, and now we've got the church and everything is up and running. And this is one of, frankly, my biggest problems with Calvary Chapel, is that they were really good at staying true to the Bible and telling its stories and taking its moral lessons. But learning from history, learning from the early Christians, that just wasn't something that I heard a lot about. And that's just my personal experience. Other churches might be different, but that was one of the things that changed everything. Because when I actually looked at what the early church fathers said, how they acknowledged the primacy of Rome, how they had a system of bishops, and this last thing, which is the next reason on why I became Catholic, how the Eucharist is literally the body and blood of Christ. I was like, well, it's a no-brainer to be Catholic. So on that note, communion, what happens during the Mass. And so going back to the timeline, so now I'm like, okay, I'm going to convert to Catholicism. So I joined RCIA, I start learning about the Catholic Church, its teachings, and then eventually, Easter 2023, I'm baptized and confirmed Catholic. And that's another thing, real quick, before I talk about the Eucharist. I wasn't baptized. That is absurd. Now I read the Bible, and I'm like, I wasn't baptized? Jesus makes it very clear that baptism is important. Baptism might be the difference between life and death. And it wasn't like, I was a guy who went to Calvary Chapel, 3 times in my entire life. I was going weekly. I had gone to Calvary Chapel hundreds of times. Nobody ever said, Evan, would you like to get baptized? Because I would have said yes. I want to go on and get baptized. But that's the thing, is that at Calvary Chapel, they treated baptism like it was a symbol. Like the same level of recommendation and importance of like wearing a cross necklace. Like it's nice, it's good, but it's just a symbolic reminder of your faith. And so then I was eventually baptized and confirmed Catholic. And that night was such a beautiful night. It was the day I became Catholic. It was the best day of my life ever. But there was a problem because my parents were not there. My dad, to be fair, was there for 5 minutes, but he left because he said it was weird. My mom, on the other hand, canceled 30 minutes before because she said Catholics worship spirits, and I can't support you, Evan, on your decision. And so, yeah, that was kind of where it was. And so I love my parents, of course, but them disagreeing with my Catholic faith definitely was a very difficult part of my life. I remember we would always argue, and we would always have these different fights about why I'm becoming Catholic and why I'm not becoming Catholic. And it kind of made me think, like, why? Why am I being Catholic? And the biggest reason, in addition to these other ones, but this one is the most important, is the Eucharist. And the Eucharist being the literal body and blood of Christ. Because don't get me wrong, that first year when I was Catholic, it was really rough. Where I used to live in Las Vegas, the Catholic Church's community was dead. There weren't really any young people. Most churches were just filled with old people, and it was really hard as a young person to find community. I remember one night I was really frustrated, and I was like, why did I even become Catholic? I can't even find any friends that are Catholic. I was even like, maybe I should go back to Calvary Chapel. And that's a valid concern. But then I was like, I would rather be in the most boring, dead Catholic church than the most hip and active Calvary Chapel because of the Eucharist. Because every Sunday, we eat the Eucharist and we receive Jesus literally. That is what it means to be Catholic. That's the source and summit of our faith. And so looking at the Bible makes it very clear that we must eat of his body and drink of his blood. And that if we don't, we'll have no life in us. And so that was one thing where over time, me becoming Catholic, I just felt more and more love for it. And I just became strengthened in it. There are some weeks where I literally tear up taking the Eucharist because it is Jesus Christ, his sacrifice for us, being made physical. And the Eucharist is my highway to heaven. But then that became another concern and why I became Catholic. One of the biggest objections to Catholicism I would hear from my friends and family was that Catholics don't follow the Bible. Where can you find all these different rituals you have in the Bible? But that's the thing. We can go line by line. We can find these different beliefs in the Bible. And I can give you apologetics reasons of why we do certain things. But just inherently, the Catholic Church defined the books of the Bible. Bible just means library. And so back then, there were hundreds of different books floating around. And it was the Catholic Church that formally defined these 73 books, or the 66 books in the Bible that Protestants have today, as the inspired words of God. And so that's the thing, is that we can go back and forth about this all day. But even the very books that we're arguing over were defined by the Catholic Church. But it's also pretty valid too, because if you're just reading the Bible, just like literally, you're just looking at it, a lot of beliefs are really hard to parse through. Like, for example, the Trinity. It's hard to find that literally in the Bible. Even the idea that Jesus Christ is God. It's not so clear at points. Or whether baptism is efficacious for salvation. If you're plainly reading the Bible, some of these things are a bit up in the air. And so inherently speaking, that's why we need the Catholic Church, because we needed an authority that can interpret the Bible. Because, and I don't want to straw man Protestants because they're not all like this, that's how you can get Protestant churches that deny the Trinity, that preach the prosperity gospel, that allow female pastors, that literally have Cybertrucks on stage. And so as I continue to be Catholic, another reason why I stayed, because it was the witness of seeing good Catholics. I remember one of my jobs after high school was working for a Catholic church, and the priest just had such a joyful witness. I remember learning that priests don't take a salary, that they instead get a small stipend and the church pays for everything. I remember just thinking how cool that was. Because I remember at Calvary Chapel, in a lot of Protestant churches, one of the biggest disagreements is how much is the pastor being paid. But regardless, talking to Catholics and feeling the love that they had and the presence of the Holy Spirit within them, and learning about the stories of the saints was so cool. I remember learning about the stories of Mother Teresa, how she literally received this vision from God that told her to go into the slums of India. Everyone told her that it was crazy, it would never work, and she started a convent there, and it became one of the largest organizations in the world. I remember learning about St. Francis of Assisi, who grew up a rich man, left it all behind to follow God. He was literally like a homeless beggar. And so he wanted to start the Franciscan order. But to do that, you had to get permission from the Pope. So Francis just literally went up to the Pope's palace and was like, hey, I want to start an order. And the Pope was like, who are you? What the heck? You're crazy. But then that night, the Pope had a dream. Was God telling him they should give St. Francis the authority to start the new order. So the next day he calls up Francis, and then he does. It's things like that are literally like, I like to say sometimes that the Catholic Church is like Harry Potter in the sense of like wonder and magic that just is presence. It's just so cool. Like, I don't know how else to put it. We live in a world that feels so stale and boring. And even like Protestant churches, they feel like that. Like, it's just more the same. It's pop music, but we've added a Christian spin to it. It's TED Talks and college lectures, but we've added a Christian spin to it. I want something that's different. And I found that in the Catholic Church. But then while it is incredibly beautiful, another reason why I became Catholic was because of how universal it was. I remember walking into Catholic churches all across America and all over the world, and it was the exact same. The Mass was the exact same structure. The priest did the same things at the same times. We said the same prayers at the same times. We had the same readings. And this just made everything feel more grounded. And honestly, it just made modern church culture feel so cringe, frankly. And that led into another reason why I became Catholic, was the sense of spiritual depth. Now, I mentioned that I thought the Protestant church felt shallow, but the inverse is that the Catholic church felt so rich. It felt like you could literally dive in, and there's so many different prayers to master and saints to learn about. I loved how the silence and ritual became tools for transformation. I felt like with the tools of the Catholic Church, I could become a saint. I'm literally calling my mom right now. I haven't talked to her about this in so long. Hey, what's up, Mom? I just wanted to ask you what you thought about me being Catholic.
When you were 17, we had a conversation, and you asked what I thought. No, you didn't ask me. You told me what you were going to do. And I told you that to follow your heart and to just do your research.
Was it hard when I became Catholic?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little hard. I wish I could just take what's in my mind or take my knowledge and put it in your head, but sometimes I feel like we have to experience things to understand things.
Well, I love you, Mom, and I thank you for raising me, even if we disagree.
I love you too, Evan.
All right, bye, Mom. I know it might not seem like much, but just being able to talk to my mom and just getting, I guess, closure, it's good. When I reflect on the past 4 years of being Catholic, it was the best decision I ever made. Even though sometimes, honestly, I do have doubts, and being a Christian is hard, I still love it. I like to tell people that I didn't convert to Catholicism. I came home, and the Catholic Church is the best home ever.